Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here today. This is Nicole, and today's session is all about black and white portrait editing. Topaz Black and White Effects is a great piece of software to convert a portrait into a black and white image. It contains tools like color filters, selective smoothing and detail brushes, advanced toning, and much more. So today we're going to be covering how to transform your image into a beautiful black and white using those tools. So we're going to be walking through many of the different styles that you can quickly achieve using our presets and collections first. And then we're going to be talking about the specific tools that I feel are best for portrait editing. And we're going to be staying within black and white effects here today to really show you that you can have a full workflow with your black and white conversion on portrait images within this one program. Let me show you this before and after. We're going to start off with this image because I feel like it's a pretty classic portrait that conversion that where we'll be using many of the technical tools I feel would be useful in this type of conversion. So here's a before image, which is a great before image to start off with, and then after. And this was black and white effects only. So let's go ahead and take this image into black and white effects. I'm going to say Control J. Just make a quick background copy and come over to Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Black and White Effects. Now, if you're unfamiliar with black and white effects, definitely check out the introduction to the program. It really goes over all of the tools and the full program quite thoroughly. Today, we're going to be focusing on finding different styles that really work with portraits and then using the tools for a couple of different particular workflows versus going over every single tool because it is a very comprehensive program. So I want to really focus in on the portrait aspect of it. But I'm going to come over here to my lower right-hand side and press Reset All just to get back to the grayscale conversion. And the first thing I'd like to do is take a look at some of the presets that we have available for you to quickly start off on certain looks that you might go after. Now, the easiest way to check out what we have available for you is just to come over to our collection over here on the upper left of the program and click on the grid icons that are to the right of each collection. And that's going to pull up a quick grid view for you to take a look at the presets within that collection. And I feel like that's the easiest way to just immediately understand what's in that collection. And we have a lot of popular portrait effects. Now, it doesn't look great on this particular image, but things like the high key portrait effects, which are great for studio portraits, are more dramatic, and low key as well, are located within this traditional collection. And then we have our more standard presets that I really like for portraits, and that's just going to be your warm tones and your cool tones. And that's going to give you a nice classic tones and silver gelatin type of feel to your portraits. And you can just click on that, and here's before and after. This was the warm tone one. So you can quickly just get to some really nice conversions in that traditional collection. If you're more interested in toned presets or toned looks, you can go into that toned collection and start off with a tone that you really enjoy. So if you like sepia tones and really like those rich dark blacks, you can come down, or I'm sorry, selenium tones, you can come down and maybe start off with a selenium tone. That gives you a nice starting point. Or if you're more interested in maybe a sepia or a warm tone, you can come down into your sepia area and choose one of those as well to start off with. One area that people kind of skip over when it comes to portraits because it's more stylized is our stylized collection. But don't skip over that if you're looking for more dramatic conversions, such as grunge effects, which are great for certain character portraits in black and white effects. We have our detailed grunge here, as well as our dynamic 1 grunge and our dynamic 2 grunge. It's going to be really nice and very detailed to get very sharp and detailed portrait grungy type portraits. But also within this one, we have our silhouettes, which I really like. Again, it's going to be more of a very stylized effect, but it's something that's quite popular in certain types of black and white portraiture. So you can start off with this very quickly. This is the quad tone silhouette preset to within that Stylized Collection. All you have to do at that point to really get it to where you want in the silhouette style, go into your finishing touches, open up your quad tone, and just play around with these 2 middle sliders to get the right type of silhouette that you might be after. So this is one way to kind of play around with that overall effect if you like that. All right, I'm going to press reset all, and now let's come over to our right-hand side and actually go through a more traditional workflow that you might see for this type of image. And I'm just going to kind of go over my particular ways of working within black and white effects. It's not just linear from top to bottom because I look at certain things first, the more important things that I consider in a portrait image. And so this is very subjective. This might not be the way that you work, but you can at least take away how each tool is used and which tools might be more effective on your portrait images than other tools. So the first thing that I do when I look at a portrait image is I look at the skin tone. And I really like to adjust the skin of my subject to what I want it to be first, and then work with the other tones. And that's because usually if I'm working with my brightness and contrast, overall brightness and contrast first, the skin is something that I come to eventually, and then it's going to change my overall brightness and contrast. So I like to kind of concentrate on how I want the skin to work, if I want to brighten it up or darken it up, and then move on from there. One of the greatest tools that we have within black and white effects that I think work beautifully with skin tones is going to be the color filters or color sensitivity. I usually start off with the color filters when it comes to portrait imagery just because the red, orange, or yellow color filters are great starting points just to kind of brighten up skin tones. It works on all skin tones, and then it darkens up other areas that might be taking away from the image. But if it ends up not working for your image, that's when I go into the color sensitivity. But usually what I do is I start with these quick tools up in the up top panel here on the right-hand side. These little circles are actually those color filters. So if you just click on the red circle, it'll pull up the color filter menu below, and it'll apply this default red filter. And you can tell it automatically will just, now this is the orange one I just clicked on, it'll just brighten up those red tones or orange tones or yellow tones, and it will darken up the complementary tones of that area. So for example, with your red tones, your reds are going to become brighter, but things like blue, such as her eyes, are going to become darker. So let me just click that color filter off and back on. So seeing that her eyes are going a little bit dark and I don't really want that to happen, I'm going to move on to my orange because I think I'll still get some nice lightening of the skin without, well, it's still darkening her eyes quite a bit, so I'll move on to the yellow. And there, I like that yellow quite a bit. So here's before, here's before the color filter, and here's after. It's still darkening them up a little bit, but not nearly as much. Everything is a little bit too strong with this overall color filter anyway, so I'm going to take that to the left, the strength, and kind of tone that down, but so that will tone everything down. But here it is before and after. I'm going to take that strength up just a touch more. One more time, before and after, and I like that. All right, so now that I've worked with her skin tone and kind of gotten it to an area, brightened it up, now I can go in and work with some other things and not have to worry about that so much. So the next thing that I usually do when it comes to portrait editing is I will try to get a good black point and a good white point and work with my overall contrast. When I do that, I like to go into the zone system tool that we have within black and white effects, and the way that you get there is just by coming up to this upper right corner and click on the Z icon, and that's going to open up the zone system tool that we have for you. The zone system is a traditional zone system. It breaks your image down into 10 different, well, for this one, it's 11 different tonal areas. 0 is going to be your blacks, zone 10 is going to be your whites, and then it's just going to break your image down to all the different tones in between. And you can click on the tones and click off of them by just clicking on the numbers themselves to see what area of your image is in what zone. So for this part of the process, when I'm trying to find my blacks and my whites, I like to turn on just my blacks at the 0 and just my whites, so I can see what areas of my image are black or white if there are any. So right off the bat, I can see that I don't have any blacks going on right now, and that's an issue when it comes to black and white editing. You really want to have at least an area of black to give your image some depth and nice pop. Especially if you're going for something, that type of look, and I am here. I'm going to click on the zone 1 to see, there we go. Okay, so now we have some zone 1s, which is going to be almost black, but not quite. So I'd like to try to get some of these zone 1 areas into this zone 0. That's what I'm going to focus on for my blacks. I already see that I have quite a few whites, especially within my background here, and that works for me. So I'm going to turn off my whites. I'm not going to worry about my whites, and I'm not going to worry about the fact that these areas are clipped because there's no information in them if they're in that zone 10 white. But I am going to add some tone into the image later on in my finishing touches category, and that will take away just the clippingness of that white and add some actual color tone in there, so we won't have to worry about those. But I do want to get some definite blacks working, so I'm going to leave the 0 and the 1 on, and I'm going to come into my basic exposure. I'm pretty happy with my brightness and the overall contrast. I just want to get more blacks going and get some darker areas. The way that you can quickly do that is come down to your boost blacks and just move that to the right. It's going to take your darks closer to black. And as I start pushing to this right, I start to see that some of these zone 1 areas are moving into the zone 0, and you can tell that by the different crosshatches. And so let me go ahead and turn that zone 1 off. And now I can see just my zone 0, which is going to be pure black. And I like what's happening there. I'm actually going to take that a little bit more to the right. And what I'm trying to make sure is that the areas that are actually turning into zone 0 are not important areas where I need to see a lot of detail, and make sure that those detailed areas where I do need to see some shadow detail are not going into zone 0. So I'm fairly happy here. I'm going to turn that zone 0 off so I can see the actual image itself. And it looks a little strong, so what I'm going to do is just turn that 0 back on, take my boost blacks a little back towards, I think I'm happier there. Yes, I definitely am. Okay, now those transitions feel a little bit more natural to black. So I really like what's happening there. Here's before, here's after. That's only with my boost black slider. So you can really take advantage of these contrast sliders here with the boost blacks and boost whites. All right, now I'm going to come down to my adaptive exposure. Now, a lot of people shy away from adaptive exposure when it comes to portraits. What adaptive exposure is it adds local contrast or kind of a tone mapped HDR effect very easily just by 2 sliders, the adjustment or the adaptive exposure and region sliders. If you click it on in many portrait images, it just starts to grunge up everything really quickly. And it's a really stylized effect in its default. This isn't too stylized, but it definitely increases the grunginess of skin, and it does some pretty heavy contrast and exposure adjustments that aren't necessarily very flattering for a lot of portraits. But don't be shied away by that default setting. What I love to work with within the adaptive exposure is getting a little bit of localized contrast and really pulling out some interesting tones, so it's not so, it just gives some nice punch to the image. But one thing I have to be careful of is the detail. So the first thing that I do when I come into the adaptive exposure is come down to this process details independently. By default, your detail adjustments are connected to the adaptive exposure adjustments. So as you increase your adaptive exposure, by default, you're going to be increasing and crunching up your detail. And if you don't want that to happen as you adjust your adaptive exposure, which you usually don't when it comes to a more classic portrait conversion, then come to your process details independently. It's immediately going to smooth everything out. Let me go ahead and scroll in so you see that one more time. Here's without the process details independently, and now I'm just going to click that on. and it smoothed those details right back out to where they were. And now I can just work on my exposure and then work on my details separately. So for my adaptive exposure adjustments by themselves, here's before and after. It just feels a little strong for me. I like what it's doing to the background, and I like where it's adding shadow and highlights. It just feels too strong. So just take that adaptive exposure down if you feel like you like what's happening as far as the way that it's balancing out the exposure, but it just feels like it's taking it a little strong. Take that adaptive exposure to the left. If you want to add more detail into your shadows and more detail into your highlights and really kind of balance out the tone and take away the overall contrast and make it more everything the same tone, but they still have nice contrast locally, you can take that regions to the right and it will start to fill in some of those areas of clipping, opening up your highlights and opening up your shadow areas as well. I actually like some of what's going on at the regions 8 where we were, and I just wanted to take that adaptive exposure down to about maybe 0.15 to get a little punch, and that was it. Here's before and after. Now the other area that you have to know about within the adaptive exposure when it comes to portrait editing is the detail sliders, but specifically the detail boost slider. I rarely will add overall detail to a portrait image. I will add selective detail to eyes and lips and hair and any areas where I want my viewer's eye to travel, but I'm not going to put it everywhere. So I rarely will add detail using this detail slider, and if I take that detail slider to the left, it's going to take out detail where I need that detail overall. So I don't really touch that, but this detail boost slider is going to work on the very smallest details within your image. So areas like pores and fine lines are going to be affected by this detail boost slider. When you take it to the right, it produces an amazing grunge effect that is really popular in certain black and white, especially if you're working with, architecture or some landscape images and you really want to get some certain effects. But take this to the left with a portrait image and you start to smooth out pores and fine lines and areas of very small detail, and it does it in a very nice way. So here's before, here's after. That's a little too strong for me, so I'm going to add some of that back in, and we'll selectively take out more of those lines and pores a little bit later on, but I can do it on an overall basis right now and get a lot of that detail just to kind of remove, and I like that. So that detail boost slider is really nice for skin. You should know about that. I'm going to take that adaptive exposure down just a touch more and move on. Color sensitivity, if I didn't like the color filter the way that it applied to the overall image and it just wasn't working as far as trying to adjust the skin, then I would turn that color filter off and not use that adjustment and instead come into my color sensitivity and specifically work there on brightening certain skin tones, darkening other areas, things like that. However, I did like that color filter adjustment, so I'm going to click that back on. And within my color sensitivity, let me return that all to default. I'm going to turn it on. I really want to pinpoint certain colors, but not necessarily the skin. So here's before, here's after. As I look at the before image, I notice that her skin color has a lot of pink and red undertones. So I know if I move that red slider around, I'm going to really affect that pink and red of her skin. And I don't really want to do that. But I do see a lot of yellow that I maybe want to darken up just a touch. So her hair and the scarf, maybe a little of the background. So if I take my yellow slider to the left, I'm just going to be affecting the yellow range, and it's going to affect her skin a little bit because there's some yellow undertones there, but it's mostly affecting her hair and that scarf and a few of the things in the background, and I like that. The green, I'm really not that interested in. I do want to brighten up the iris of her eyes and really get that to stand out. So I'm going to use the cyan and blue and actually take that to the right and start to really bring out the iris of her eyes, which is really nice to do when it comes to black and white portraiture, to kind of get a little bit, especially when you're dealing with blue eyes or green eyes, to get a little bit more contrast between the edge of the between the outside ring of the iris and the pupil and the inside ring of the iris. So I like what's happening there. and I'm happy. So I'm going to unclick my color sensitivity. I don't really need to use my curve tool at this stage for this image, so I'm not really interested in that. I'm done with my conversions. I don't want to work with any creative effects, any diffusion. Diffusion is really nice sometimes when it comes to more beauty type of portraits. It's going to overall soften everything. It's a really beautiful effect. We're not going to use it here today, but that is one area on portraits that you should know about. Local adjustments, though, this is very important when it comes to portrait editing. Our local adjustments brushes include 5 different brushes: dodge, burn, color, detail, and smooth. We're not going to use the dodge and burn in this particular workflow. We'll do it within the next one, but we are going to use the detail and smooth, which is awesome for skin and eyes. So smooth, if you use that on the skin in a very delicate way, it's going to softly smooth out things like pores and small wrinkles, small lines, but it's going to leave the larger character lines that are really essential to keeping the character of somebody's face intact. You don't want to take away all of these really beautiful laugh lines and completely smooth them out. You can do so with this smooth brush if you do it at a very high level, but it becomes unnatural and kind of plasticky. But if you use it at a very soft level, you can really get some beautiful results, all within black and white effects. So I'm just going to scroll into 100% so we can see exactly what we're doing here to her face. I've clicked on my smooth local adjustment brush. I'm going to leave the overall strength at 0.20. A lot of people ask, what does the overall strength slider mean within all of your adjustment brushes? And you can basically think about it as if it's a layer and you're working in Photoshop, it's kind of like the opacity of the layer. And then below all of these adjustments, this opacity slider is actually the opacity of your brush. So you can work on an image in a very soft and delicate way. And then if you want to increase the overall strength of it without having to continue working with your brush, you can just come up to your overall strength and move that to the left or right to really get it exactly where you want. So we'll take a look at that here in just a second. But now that we're on the smooth brush, I just want to make sure that my smooth brush is the one that's checked, which is. My brush size, I will take that down to where, not too far down, because she has quite a bit of skin, so right about here looks good. My opacity, I will take down to about 0.20. I don't want to over soften. And then the hardness I'll leave down completely. The edge aware, I will leave at 0.5. It's about halfway. 0 is going to mean that it's not edge aware at all. It won't detect edges within your image. And 1, when I go all the way to 1, it's going to be 100% edge aware, which means that it will be very sensitive to different colors and values and lines within your image. So if I leave it at 0.5, it's going to be kind of a happy medium. So things like skin texture, where there's slight transitions of color, it's not going to kind of detect those edges, but it will detect the edges that are really strong, such as the eyebrows against the skin. So that's one instance in where a mid value of that edge aware is really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting the smooth brush on her skin. What you want to be aware of doing, or sure that you do whenever you have your edge aware turned on to any degree, is to make sure that you keep the crosshairs of your brush in the area or on the color that you want to affect, and just make sure not to go into the areas of tone or color that you do not want to affect. So as long as you keep that crosshair where you want to affect, it's going to just get those values. And you can see over here on the left that even though my brush went very much into her eye and things like that, it still was quite edge aware. And I do want to get the certain areas there, okay? Now I'm going to come down and get her chin as well. I'll show you this before and after. It's pretty subtle when you're working with it, so it's easy to continue to get a little over softened, but let me show you just before and after. This is only after going over once. Here's before and after. So this is pretty subtle still, but it's nice on the areas that just have the pores. Now let's go ahead and take our edge aware brush all the way to 0, because I don't want it to miss the heavier transitions of color with the heavier laugh lines here, or heavier character lines that I do want to smooth up just a touch. So I'm going to take my edge of wear down and take my brush size down. I'm going to keep it very soft with my hardness all the way at 0, and then my opacity I'll keep at 0.2. And I'm just going to go over the areas that have a little bit more heavier lines that I want to soften up just a touch. Again, I don't like to go too soft because I don't want to take away important features of somebody's face, but I do want them to be happy with my editing, and don't want I want to smooth it out just a touch for them. So I'm going to come up to her forehead and get a few of those forehead creases a little bit smoother, and maybe just a touch more under this eye. There we go. So here's before and after. Now, if you want to increase the strength at this stage and you don't want to continue painting on her face, you can just take that overall strength slider and move it to the right. And it's now before and after. It's a little bit more, it's a little stronger just by using that overall strength slider versus not using it. I'm going to take that back down to 0.25. And now we're going to work with our detail brush. And the detail brush is something that I think is the #1 tool for me when it comes to portrait editing, actually, period, within this program. I love the detail brush. It's a selective detail brush. It's so easy to paint in detail exactly where you want it in an edge-aware method. So it's very selective and simple to use. So the detail brush, same tools below as the smooth brush. I'm going to leave the overall strength at 0.2. I'm going to keep my brush size fairly low because I'm only going to be working on the eyes and lips within this detail adjustment. The opacity I'll take up to about 0.3 to get that a little bit more stronger for you to see on your screens at home. I'll leave that hardness down, and I'll take that edge wear all the way to 1. And now what I'm going to do is, you know what, I'll keep that edge wear down for the eyes and just be careful about where I go, since there are lots of transitions of color within her eye. And I will go ahead and paint in detail at least once over the whites of her eyes and kind of around the edges of the lids, all within the eye, maybe just a touch on the eyelashes, but I'll only do that once. And then I'll come in a couple more times and really just focus in on the irises and pupils themselves, get some nice contrast and detail on each eye. So now I'm going to do this on the other eye as well, just get a little bit in the whites of the eye and then come in and work specifically on the irises, pupils, and area there. And now I'm going to come into the lips, and for that I'll go ahead and go edge wear, since we have several different transitions that we don't want to work on, and just do 1 or 2 times over her lips to kind of get her lips to stand out as well. And now let me show you that before and after. Here's before. Now this is overall local adjustment, so you'll see the smoothing and the detail work that we just did, and after. So it really makes a large impact on the overall image, this detail and smoothing local adjustment brushes. Again, here's before and after. All right, so now let's move on to the finishing touches. Within our finishing touches, you'll find the things that really can make your image stand apart, other than just the overall exposure and image enhancement. You have things like your toning adjustments within your silver and paper tone and your quad tone, adding film grain back in to get a realistic effect, adding your borders, edge exposures, vignettes, and then actually bringing back in some color using your transparency slider. So we'll use a couple of these within this workflow and a couple more within the next workflow. So for this one, I just want to get a very nice warm tone. I love warm tones when it comes to portraits. I think it's really beautiful when it comes to more standard classic portraits. So I'm just going to click on my silver and paper tone, which has a very lovely default warm tone to it. One thing within this silver and paper tone default, by just clicking it on, one thing I always notice is that my whites don't have enough tone in them when it comes to portraits. And since we have some fairly significant clipping going on in our whites in the background, which we saw at the beginning using that zone system, I want to make sure that those have some tone in there. So know that that default, when you just turn it on, that paper tone strength is all the way down at 0. To add a little bit more color into those highlights, just take that paper tone strength over to the right, and it's just going to warm up those highlights a little bit more. And then if the overall tone becomes a little too strong, which it usually does for me, I take my overall tonal strength down. So I still have that tone going into my highlights, but now I have a little bit softer of an overall warm tone. So here's before and after. Now, if you don't like warm tone or if you want to adjust that, it's very easy to do so. You can come into your silver hue, which is going to work on your darker grays and your black areas, and change that tone around. So let's say you want to make that a little bit more orange or red. You can just move that to the left. It's going to go a little bit more orange and red in those darker tones. And maybe in your paper hue, which is going to work on your whites and your lighter tones, if you maybe want to go a little bit more yellow or green, you can push that a little to the right. If you really want to highlight one of those colors, so maybe I want to highlight the silver hue, how red it is, I can take that silver tone strength up to the right. And then I can even balance it more towards my silver tone by moving my balance around. To the right will really bring out those silver tones, and to the left is going to bring out my paper tones a little bit more. But I'm going to reset and get back to that default tone where we had it before, add in some paper tone, take my overall toner strength down, and that's a really beautiful warm tone to quickly add into your portrait image if you like that warm tone effect. One thing that I always usually do with any of my black and white conversions is add film grain back in. But with portraits, if you're not going for a more grungy or for a more, you don't really want to see the film grain, then you can go into our grain library and choose a very, very fine grain. And one that I recommend is going to be, by default, it's the Kodak Tri-X 400, which is fine grain, but you'll still see it a little bit, especially within smoother areas. So here's before. If you notice in the background is really where you'll see it. And let me turn that back on. Let me just turn that grain contrast a little bit higher so you can really see it. Here's before and after. So if you want an even finer grain, which I usually like to do if I'm doing a more classic portrait conversion, I like to come in and find a 100 or less ISO. So maybe the Kodak T-Max Pro 100. Where are you? There you are. Kodak T-Max Pro 100. I really love this one for portraits because it's very fine, but it allows for a realistic effect to come back in. Here's before and after. So some of the areas that feel just a little too smooth, like the bridge of her nose for me and maybe a little bit of her forehead, all of a sudden start to have a little bit more realistic, less plasticky effect. So very quickly you can add that back in with grain. So I'd use that all the time. Lastly, for this image, I like to show off the edge exposure. When it comes to portraits and backgrounds, I really like to make sure that the viewer's eye will go directly to my subject and move in, and that it's not being distracted. For me, that's really important that the tones don't kind of leak off of the frame, I guess you can say. So over here on this top left corner, this top edge and this left edge, you have a lot of tone that just doesn't really exist. It kind of just goes, I like to kind of close it up a little with a darker tone along those edges so your eye doesn't drift that direction and instead it goes directly to the subject. Edge exposure is a great tool if you're happy with a couple of the edges within your image, like the right edge has some nice tone that is kind of containing that overall frame, and the bottom edge definitely has some nice tone in there, and you just want to apply it to a couple of your edges. This edge exposure is a darkroom inspired tool. It's really lovely to be able to do that. So I'm just going to turn that on. Okay, great. So I'm just going to turn that on and work on my top and my left edge. The first one that comes open, it looks like is my left edge. And I'm going to leave my edge size and edge transition right where they are. It's a fairly good value if you just want to add a little bit of tone very quickly to one of your edges. And I'm going to move my edge exposure to the right, keeping an eye on my left edge. And it's very subtle whenever you start working with it, but then you can turn it off and on to see the difference. Here's before and after, and it just closes up that left corner really nicely. Now I need to work on that top edge, just to work on that as well. Edge size and transition, I'm going to leave there, and I'll just move that as well. So here's before, here's after. I've just kind of completed this natural vignette that was happening on my right and my bottom edges, but not on my left and my top. That top one is a little bit too large for my taste. I'm just going to take that edge size down. There we go. All right, so that is where I would end for this particular kind of more classic black and white portrait conversion. I think that it really shows off a lot of the tools that we have within black and white effects, where you can come in from scratch and do a full portrait editing workflow, working on skin, working on selective detail, things that are really important within portrait editing. Within dodging and burning is also really important. So if your teeth are have a little bit too much tone to them, you can dodge some of the, make your teeth a little bit lighter with that dodge tool. So all of those local adjustments are really important. One thing I do want to show off really quickly, because I get this a lot, the transparency slider. Transparency slider allows for you to add color back into your image, that original image color. So you can, it doesn't do it full on 100%, but you can add in quite a bit. I think it's 75% of the original color back in. But one of the questions I get is, if you have a layered program such as Photoshop, why would you use this overall transparency slider within black and white effects? Well, there's a very good reason why, especially when it comes to all the work that you just did. If you know you're going to add back in certain amounts of color within Photoshop, but you want to leave the same amount of sharpening that you worked on and same amount of smoothing that you worked on in her skin. And if you did that in Photoshop or Photoshop Elements or Paint Shop Pro, if you just lowered the opacity of the layer itself, it would lower everything that you did. When you do it within black and white effects, it keeps all of the work that you did as far as your tones, your conversion, actual blacks and whites, and your overall tone, as well as the dodging and burning and, excuse me, I'm losing smoothing and detail work, including your toning that you do with your silver and paper tone or your quad tone. So if I uncheck that and check that back on, you can see that that warm tone that we applied is still being applied full effect. So all this transparency slider does is bring back color. It doesn't take away any of the adjustments that we did anywhere else, which if you just did a layer opacity, it would take away all those adjustments. So that's one thing that you can know about when working with that transparency slider within black and white effects, why it's useful to blend your color back in there versus blend it back in versus using a layer blend. All right, so I am going to take that transparency off. I wanted to keep this black and white. I'm going to say okay, and back in. I hope that gave you a good overview of some of the tools. Now I want to quickly show you how you can get certain styles that seem to be pretty popular these days, especially when it comes to maybe street photography or travel photography, where you get to take certain types of images and you want to add more of a grunge effect to a portrait. So let's go over to this image. Here we go. I love this image of this gentleman, and his face just tells a story. These lines are beautiful on his face, and the actual image for me just screams, add a little bit of grunge to me and kind of get more detail into the features of his face versus less detail, which we were trying to do in the last workflow. So I want to go ahead and show you how you can quickly get this type of effect using black and white effects. So I'm going to take this background image and just do a quick copy, Control J, go back into black and white effects. One of the reasons that I think that black and white is an excellent choice for this particular image is on the left-hand side here of the image, this beautiful green color is definitely distracting from my subject. In my opinion, my eye kind of goes to that deep, rich saturation. So you'd have to work on that color anyways. And I really like the light on his face and jacket as well, and I wanted to really bring that out within black and white effects, so I thought it would be a good choice. So Topaz black and white effects. And we saw it within the first couple minutes of the session, how easy it is to add a certain style. This image is full size, so it's a little bit, there we go. Takes a little bit longer to work with when you have larger images, but definitely worth it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press reset all and get back to the default conversion. And as I was saying, in the first couple of minutes, I kind of showed you where our detailed grunge presets are, and they're in our stylized collection. So I'm just going to click on that grid view and check out some of this grunge presets that we have available. So here's detailed grunge. I really like that. It actually has a little bit of a warm tone in there and some nice detail. Here's detail smooth. So it looks like it has a little bit less of that detail boost kind of grungy effect, but that's what I'm looking for. So I like the detail grunge still a little bit more. We have dynamic 1 grunge, and the dynamic 1 grunge is going to add a little bit more of that adaptive localized exposure for an HDR type of an effect. Really great for certain styles that you might be after, really lovely within architecture and landscape. But for this image, I think I'm leaning more towards this detailed grunge with just this really nice kind of lighter warm tone going on. Okay, so let me show you. Let's take a look at what actually was used here. Looks like only our basic exposure and adaptive exposure, obviously not our localized adjustments, were used. All right, so basic and adaptive, and this is the before. We added some basic contrast, brightness, and then adaptive exposure to get that nice detail work. All right, so right off the bat, again, I like to work with I like this image right as it is, but I think with just a few quick tools, I could really make this pop. So the things that I will focus on here in this workflow are going to be his skin tone, just working with the overall exposure and tone adjustments to kind of darken up this background, lighten his skin up, maybe darken the jacket a little bit just to really have our eyes go towards his face, and then work on maybe some vignetting and a little bit more of the final effects, in addition to some detail work, adding a bit more detail to his face. So very quickly, let's work on that. I'm going to come up to my color filters first and just add in some color filter options and see if I like what they do. I'm paying attention to not only his face, but also how it affects the background and his jacket, because if I can kind of darken his jacket, lighten his face, lighten that background, darken that background with one click, then I really eliminate a lot of the work. And I did that with this one. So here is before. This is with our red default. And after. His face brightened up, his hat and his jacket darkened, the background darkened, and that's exactly what I was going after. Now, it's a little too strong for me overall. It starts to take on kind of an unrealistic effect, and I don't want that. So I'm going to take the strength slider down to maybe 0.2. 0.18 and take a look at that before and after. Before, after, much better. My eyes are going more towards his face now instead of the jacket or the background, so I like that. I am going to take it down just a touch more though. There we go. All right, so I'm happy there. The next area that I want to check out are my blacks and my whites. So I'm going to turn on my zone system, turn my mid-tone 5 off and click on my 0 and my 10. And I see that I have some highlights on his, some whites on the jacket shoulder, but also on the bridge of his nose. And I don't necessarily want any clipping going on the bridge of his nose or on his face. So we'll deal with that. And I want to add in a little bit more black to the brim of his hat. I can start to see that I have some black that's clipping, but I want to add a little bit more depth there. So I'm going to add that in. I'm going to do that through the basic exposure. I'll go ahead and take out some of the contrast in this contrast slider itself, so I can come in and work with it specifically with these boost blacks and boost whites. So now I can come in and add more black by taking my boost blacks to the right. I like that a lot better. And now my boost whites, I'm actually going to take that to the left to open up some of those, or to bring back some of those details. So in the whites. So you'll notice that the bridge of his nose is no longer clipping with those red hatch marks, and some of those red hatch marks have started to dissipate on his shoulder, so there's less clipping going on there. And now we have, let's turn on the, yes, okay, so now a lot of those highlights in his face are in zone 9 now instead of zone 10. And that's exactly where I want them. So this looks good to me. Let's turn these off and check out the before and after. Here's before and after. I brightened everything up, which I like. I want to take my boost blacks even a little bit higher. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, I'm happy with my conversion. Now I'm going to go into my local adjustments, zoom in on his face, and work with bringing out some of the detail in his face, but then really concentrating on his eyes as well. I'm going to get out of my zone system so I can grab my navigator and move right here. And I'll go to my detail brush. My detail brush, overall strength 0.2, that's fine. I'll leave my opacity, go up to about 0.3. Brush size I want to take up because I'm going to be working on his face, overall face first. I'm going to take my edge aware down, my hardness down, and just go over his whole face, just to bring out a tiny bit more detail overall. Okay, and now I want to specifically go over some of the character lines in his eyes a little bit more. So I'm going to take my brush size down and just concentrate on the branching out of these lines around his left eye, kind of go up into the eyebrows, get a little bit more. I don't want to accentuate all the lines. I just want to really accentuate the ones that I feel add something to his face. And then now that I've done that, I'm going to take my brush size even farther down and just work on the eyes themselves, going over the whites of his eyes to kind of get some of those catch lights and the iris, and then going over just the iris a few more times to really bring out that area and have my viewer's eye just go directly there. Okay, so that's pretty nice. Let me show you this before and after. Here's before and after. So it didn't necessarily enhance in a bad way. It did bring a little bit more depth and contrast to those lines, but again, sometimes in that more kind of grungy effect that you're after, that can be really beneficial to be able to selectively add detail like this. I even want to have it a little bit stronger, so I'm going to take my overall strength up much more, and here's before and after. So I'm happy there. Another brush that I'm going to use here for this particular image is going to be the burn brush to add a little bit more tone into his shoulder of his jacket without adding tone anywhere else. So I'm just going to add a little bit more to his jacket. I'm going to go to the burn tool, and I will make this edge aware completely at 1 so I can just focus on this bright area versus anywhere else in the background. I don't have to worry about going over into the edge. I'll take my brush size up. My opacity I'll leave at 0.3, hardness all the way down. I'll just keep the crosshairs of my brush on the edge of the jacket, come in, maybe go one more time on the edge of the jacket. It's a little strong, so I'll take that overall strength down just a touch. And now here's before. Keep an eye on that jacket. And after, and I just kind of brought a little bit more tone into that shoulder. All right, I'm happy there with my local adjustments. Finishing touches. For this, I think I'll just use another silver paper tone warm tone real quick. Just click that on. I'm going to open that up and take that tonal strength down. Take my paper strength up a touch, just to give a nice little warm tone to it. Let's come down here. I do want to add some grain, but I'm just going to click on the default. I like the default for more grungy portraits like this. It's a 400 ISO. If anything, I would go in and actually take my grain contrast up just a touch to really bring out some of that grain. And I'm happy there. And with this image, the vignette would be a perfect option here to really drive our attention exactly where we want it to go on our subject. So I'm just going to click open that vignette tool and click it on. By default, the center point is in the center, but we need it to be on his face. So to do that, I'm going to click on the little center button here in the vignette area. When I click on that and then I scroll back into the image, my mouse becomes a crosshair. So I can click directly where I want the middle point of my vignette to be, and I want it to be right kind of on his cheek here. So I'll just click right there. And it's going to jump over to his face or right to where I selected. And I'm going to take my transition down, all the way down, and that's going to allow me to see very hard-edged vignette and what's going on. And that's just a tool that I like to use sometimes to get very specific vignette choices made. I'm going to take my curvature to be more oval than square, and I'm going to increase the size just a touch. And the strength is way too dark for me, so I'm going to take that to the right and move it back towards 0, and that's just going to lighten up that vignette, maybe about -0.12. Yeah, I like that a lot better. And now my vignette transition, I'll take that back up, and it'll soften up the line of that transition and give me a much more natural transition line. So here's before, here's after. Now our eyes are absolutely going towards his face and really staying there because we've used that detail brush and really brought out those eyes in detail. So I'm going to press OK and be done. And I hope this gave you a good of what tools can be used to create this kind of grungy, more detailed black and white effect for portraiture. Thank you again, and I hope you have a good morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever you are, and I hope you're able to join us for a quick tip session on Thursday. Bye, everyone.